Welcome back to the Brothers Mahoney. This is Michael,
And I am James.
and today we are discussing the Mutant Phase, which is the 15th release in the monthly range of Big Finish, and it was released back in December 2000. And it's also the third part of the loosely connected Dalek Empire thing, which started with the Genocide machine, then went into the Apocalypse element, and this is the last one before Dalek Empire had its own spin off. And it's about 2 hours straight, technically 2 hours 48 seconds, but it's a pretty straight 2 hours. And one interesting thing about this one is that it's apparently a remake of an unlicensed audio visual story. Apparently, the audio visuals was a series of unlicensed stories of fan-made Doctor Who audio dramas produced back in the 1980s and early 1990s. So these were fan-made, they were unofficial. I think they had multiple people voicing the Doctor. And it's one of those random things. I mean, the funny thing is it wasn't even during, or at least it didn't even start during the Wilderness years. Unless this might have been the period in between, like, Colin Baker's first season in Trial of a Time Lord. I guess it's possible.
There was an 18-month period. That could always be the case. I don't know exactly when the first one came out, though. They are most unusual, though, and you'd feel like something like this could only have existed during the Wilderness era, but apparently they predate.
Yeah, and a lot of the people who were involved in those audio-visual releases later went on to officially become part of Big Finish. And the Mutant Phase was originally written by Nicholas Briggs, who of course then wrote this voice in itself. So they just remade an audio-visual story, gave it a glow-up, and then we have this.
And now it's official.
Yeah, and the original Mutant Phase, I think it's actually up on YouTube right now, and it was released in 1986, if you want an interesting piece of history. And this was also the last of the main range to be released on cassette, which will show right here for posterity. And it features the 5th Doctor and Nyssa. And the plot is as follows. In the 22nd century, the Daleks have occupied planet Earth. By the 43rd century, only a handful of humans survive. Still further into the distant future, a Thal scientist must choose whether to betray his heritage or see the universe destroyed. When the Doctor and Nyssa find themselves trapped in this deadly chain of events, they must decide who the real enemies are. What is certain is that no matter where the Doctor turns, the Daleks will be waiting for him. What could possibly be worse than that? The Mutant Phase. And this Mutant Phase in question is some type of, I guess, genetic contagion that seems to be impacting the Daleks, and the Daleks don't much care for it, as you might be able to imagine.
Yeah, and with the Daleks' obvious obsession of genetic purity, this really goes against the entire nature. The risk of, at random, because they can't figure out why it's happening, being turned into a non-Dalek creature. And those things are fun, and we can talk about them in a bit.
Yeah, and the cast of this one has Peter Davison playing the Doctor, Sarah Sutton as Nyssa. There's a Christopher Blake voicing the Thal scientist that's mentioned in the plot, a Professor Torlum. He has a friend voiced by Jared Morgan, who is a Commander Gantius. There's a few smaller characters. There's a Sarah Wakefield voicing the Dolores, Andrew Ryan voicing Albert, and then we have Mark Gatiss voicing just some guy named Carl. And he doesn't get a ton of screen time, but to be fair, this is Mark Gatiss. And Mark Gatiss is a big name, not just in Doctor Who, but a big name in British television overall. And Gatiss was previously in, and he in fact wrote Phantasmagoria, and he's been involved in a lot of random things.
Indeed, he played the brother of Solak in, Solak, which was a big UK show, obviously. And then he also showed up in a small role, but a fun role nonetheless, in Game of Thrones, which allows mention the books were much better than usually read the books. But nonetheless, the books don't have Mark Gatiss, so maybe the show has something going for it.
Yeah, and like I said, the character Gatiss voices doesn't appear that much, but still, it's fun that Gatiss is here. And I'll say in general, I think the story here is pretty interesting. The TARDIS gets sort of stuck in a time corridor, which the Daleks are able to, I guess, manipulate. Now, I'm not, and I've said before, I'm not like a deep sciencey guy. I'm not exactly sure how this time corridor works, but I guess it's a Dalek's way of time travel. It's apparently somewhat rough, but hey, I guess it works.
Well, yeah, but it's a Time Lord saying that, and they've been able to do time travel perfectly for billions of years. So to them, anything that's not a nice TARDIS is probably going to be rough.
And since they assassinate anyone who even gets close to doing time travel, it's
Well,
not
I
like they
mean,
give much chance.
there is that. I still enjoy some of those bits. I really need to give the Apocalypse element another listen. Because there was some good Time Lord privilege in that one, I would say.
Yeah, and through the event of the story, there are at least 3 different timelines that are visited. The Doctor visits, and like I said, he's stuck in a time corridor. He can't get out of it. If he dematerializes, he might be able to get to an earlier point because he's being pulled toward a certain date. But he's still going to be limited to, I guess, the time that the time corridor is capturing. I don't think that's the right way to phrase it. But then again, I don't really know how the time corridor works. So there's 3 timelines that the Doctor actually visits, being 2158. He later goes to 4253. And then I'm not even sure if this is a specified date, but toward the end of the story, he actually ends up on Scour itself. So he even gets a face-to-face meeting with the Emperor, which is always fun.
Not only is it fun, he actually makes a reference to the last time they met, which was, if I'm not mistaken, the evil of the Daleks, a saga Doctor story. The Dr. Hill mentions that they've both had some facelifts since they last met, and that would be true if it was less as the saga Doctor. Now, interestingly enough, my brother and I haven't actually watched The Evil of the Daleks yet. We do have the DVD or whatnot, and we'll get to it, but it's actually one of the few ones that's been released that we haven't seen, which is mostly the newer ones, Celestial Toymega, Galaxy 4, among those.
Savages.
Yeah, the Savages, of course, that just came out, I think, just last month. So we've seen all of them except those, and it's going to be really fun to see those, especially when the power of the Daleks, from what I recall, was actually really good. And this is the end of that season, and from what I understand, kind of continuing that arc, showing the Daleks as a big threat. And in fact, after that one, the Daleks are gone from the stage for at least 5 years. So it's a really big Dalek story, and it's exciting that it's one that actually exists that we'll be able to enjoy.
Yeah, and speaking of classic Dalek stories, when the Doctor lands on 2158 Earth, that is, of course, during the 10-year range of the Daleks' invasion of Earth. The first Doctor landed on Earth, what was it, like 2167 or something like that?
I forget the specific year, but that does sound right, yes.
So this is about like 9 years before the first Doctor actually ends the Daleks' reign on Earth. But here the Doctor and Nyssa land on, I think it was Kansas. They actually land in this really random state in like a field. I forget whether the field was growing, but there's also a bunch of wasps there. So that's playful. I think it was a lime grove, actually.
I mean, a lime grove does sound pretty fun, although I'm not sure what that's doing in Kansas. Sounds like something that would be more in a southern area, but...
Well, that's why they sort of embraced the Daleks, because they brought more agriculture with them.
I suppose that's probably not true, because the Daleks do give a month into labor comes. So I have a feeling the people aren't happy to see these one-eyed hombres. But it is kind of funny, because when the Dr. mentions that they're in America, Nyssa asks, "Oh, is this near Alaska then?" Because all of her experience with the United States is Alaska, which we saw way back in the Land of the Dead with a nice 1990s, 1960s, I forget exactly when, story in Alaska. And I don't recall too much about it, but I do recall it did sound pretty cold. And Kansas just is not on that level of coldness that Alaska gets to. But hey, with global warming, perhaps Alaska isn't even that anymore.
Yeah, and Nyssa is a lucky woman, because not only does she get to enjoy Kansas, she gets to enjoy her meeting with the Daleks, and in fact, as a nice callback to Dalek Invasion of Earth, a Roboman. Now it's a Roboman with a somewhat hideous American accent, but it's a Roboman nonetheless. Which, as far as Classic Who is concerned, they only appeared in Dalek Invasion of Earth, right?
I could possibly recall them appearing elsewhere. I wouldn't be surprised if they were maybe referenced in Day of the Daleks, because that one introduces the Ogrins, and maybe there was a reference, or humans weren't compatible for this reason, or weren't good enough, or whatnot. It's possible it came up. I don't recall it coming up. Then we've already discussed that one, but it wouldn't surprise me if there was an offhand reference to them. But actually appearing, I'm positive it was only this one.
Yeah, and it's sort of nice to hear that classic Roboman voice, because I think we've seen the Dalek invasion of Earth probably twice. I can't imagine we saw it 3 times, but it's always possible. And it's just a nice classic voice to hear. Nyssa doesn't seem particularly wild about the Daleks herself, but luckily they're able to escape into the TARDIS, but not before Nyssa gets stung by a wasp. I called it Chekhov's wasp in my notes because it becomes important later.
Yeah, and it's brought up so many times that it was pretty obvious it was going to matter. They would have mentioned it as many times in the first 2.5 parts if it just came to nothing. This is an RTD too we're talking about here.
Yeah, and from that point on, they are dragged to 2253, and this is Earth 2,500 years after the Dalek invasion, and there seems to just be like a handful of humans left in underground bunkers. And it takes the Doctor a bit to find out exactly why Earth is in this condition. Apparently it shouldn't be. And even more strange, apparently the Thals are trying to help the humans. Well, according to some of the humans, the Thals are trying to help. So there's some confusion to the Doctor as to why this is exactly going on. Meanwhile, we see that the scientist, Torlim, and a guy named Gantius are sort of helping the Daleks try to deal with this aforementioned mutant phase. And it's sort of infects Daleks at random, and it turns them into insectoid, mindless beast type things. As you can imagine, the Daleks are not particularly fond of this. In fact, the Daleks have a very probable fear of this contagion. And it's just sort of fun hearing the Daleks legitimately freaked out when this thing pops up. It's not the cup of tea.
That's the very first cliffhanger we get in this 4-part story, when a Dalek is about to mutate, or about to start the mutation into this creature, which never does get a fun name, alas. But when it's starting to mutate into this, the Daleks all around it, one shrieking, "We must exterminate! We must exterminate!" And it's so obvious how afraid the Dalek is, and it feels so strange from a Dalek, but it really does add to the mystery and the horror of what's actually happening, because it's said by at least a couple of people in this story that whatever else you can say about the Daleks, at least they're strategic, but these creatures that they're morphing into are in many ways actually just worse than the Daleks.
Yeah, and the whole reason that the Doctor and the TARDIS are trapped in this time corridor is because the Daleks, and they don't ask because it's not the Daleks' way, but the Daleks want the Doctor's help in eradicating this mutant phase. They actually want the Doctor to go back in time toward the origins of this to try to prevent it from happening to begin with, which of course would be, temporally speaking, some of a violation. But as Torlim says, and like James just said, at least the Daleks are theoretically easier to potentially reason with, as opposed to these mindless, giant insectoid things with a metal casing on a side note, which in fact the Doctor sees a carcass of on Earth, and that's apparently why the Earth is in such a poor condition. Nothing can grow, the soil has lost all its nutrients, and it's not just Earth, but I forget how many planets did it say were destroyed like this, 30 or 40?
I don't know if it's as many as 30 or 40, but I know they had been looking around it, and they've run into at least, I think it was at least 12 or 13. That's the only number I can swear to, but it was a lot of warlords that were just completely obliterated.
Yeah, it's not like the Daleks are much of a battle thing, but I sort of enjoy when the Thals are trying to work with the Daleks. Like, Torlim has this sense of, oh, the Daleks literally can't kill me because I'm trying to help them. So he's literally like smart enough to them. He's a bit spicy at times. And all the Doctors can say is, silence! But they can't do anything. It's not like they can kill him because they need his help. So it's sort of funny, because this guy's been a prisoner of the Daleks for something like, I don't know, 15 years. I forget if there's a time given, but it's been a while. And he knows that the Daleks need him, so he's, at this point, sort of lost all fear of them. So he just casually makes jokes and the like, and yeah, the Daleks get annoyed, but they literally can't do anything. So it's sort of a funny little thing right there.
Yeah, it's very rare for the Daleks to not exterminate you the second you kind of annoy them. I still say the character who Stephen's actor played in The Chase was one of the luckiest people to ever encounter the Daleks. It's only just kind of funny to see the Daleks in a case where they're annoyed, but they can't kill the guy. They do need to solve this mystery and figure this out. So they just kind of have to live with it. And I'm not used to seeing Daleks just live with things. That's not really what they do.
Yeah, and the Daleks do eventually get the Doctor. The Doctor and Nyssa are able to divert themselves to like an underground bunker. With this plan, I think most of the second episode in. There's a little bit of mystery going on as to why Earth is in this condition. Nyssa's trying to get her arm treated, which is slowly becoming infected. Doctor's trying to figure out why things are going down this way. Then the Daleks, using a classy hover mode, can descend down the stairs into this human bunker, where they actually have like an agent in hiding. And they're able to capture Nyssa and a couple of other people. Doctor is actually able to make it to the TARDIS. But because this is the fifth Doctor, maybe just the Doctor in general, and Nyssa's life is at stake along with other people, he just actually surrenders at the end of the second episode to the Daleks' whims and comes out of the TARDIS. So it's sort of a nice, fun, dramatic scene. The Daleks end up killing someone anyway because it's just how Daleks be.
I mean, could you imagine a Dalek story where they don't kill anybody? That sounds very unlikely.
Hey, you never know. Then we get the Doctor dealing with the idea of having to help out the Dalek Emperor. And it's sort of a desperate situation because not only does this disease seem to be randomly going from Dalek to Dalek, but there's also the fact that these giant mutated Dalekian things are actually attacking and draining the resources of Skaro. The Dalek Emperor and the Daleks in general are literally hiding out in the city at risk of being destroyed because of these creatures. And they don't have a lot of time left, so they're able to draw in the Doctor, and I don't want to say blackmail him because I think the Doctor understands that it might be in the universe's best interest to try to prevent this. But then, of course, it gets into the whole time travel thing, and there's some interesting, I guess, dramatic things revolving that. And there's even arguably some elements that sort of remind me of 12 Monkeys, which was I would just say classic because it's like a 90s movie. But it's a modern-day sci-fi classic. And there's some elements here that remind me a little bit of that. But the final episodes have the Doctor, Nyssa, and some of these other characters trying to find, I guess you could say, the patient zero of the Daleks. So this is packed. It comes from like a wasp that was able to get into the casing of a Dalek and sort of cause some type of genetic mutation from that, which makes sense in context because as the Daleks were invading Earth, some of them do get a little banged up, leaving some like openings in the casing. So theoretically, given how small wasps are, you could easily imagine them getting in and causing some havoc. So it's sort of a fun way to approach the story. And what's also interesting is, and this can't be surprising, but I don't think we've heard it before, apparently the Daleks regularly take and test genetic material from each Dalek to ensure and to continue to ensure that they have the right amount of purity. So of course, anything obsessed with that type of level of purity is going to do that type of thing. And I find that sort of amusing.
Yeah, no, it's the most insane thing to think that they literally take the time to do this, but it fits in so well with their species, and I'm surprised I've never actually thought about it before. But it makes a lot of sense with the way that these things are. Plus, they're late to have a parliament, so that can't be too wrong.
Yeah, and I do have some thoughts about this story, both positive and somewhat more critical. But before diving into those, what does the timeline of this one look like?
Well, as listeners know, the TARDIS Wiki has a personal timeline for each Doctor, including the extensive extended media, ranging from the comic books, comic strips, Big Finish, and BBC audio, the multiple book ranges, and everything in between. That's official anyway. The aforementioned audio versions do not count in this. That is, at the end of the day, fan-made. Doctor Who canon, insofar as it actually has one, is a jumbled mess and has been forever. So I just like to see where the stories we're discussing fit into the universe as a whole, as continuity in the narrative timeline has always been of interest to me. Unlike so many Big Finish things, especially in the early days, this is actually just in between two Big Finish things. As the Doctor is traveling with just Nyssa, in terms of the classic series, this takes place in between Time Flight and Arc of Infinity, which Arc of Infinity always seemed like such an odd story, but we have only seen it once. But it just feels like it's such a different thing for Doctor Who to do at the time. But he stopped traveling with Tegan at the end of Time Flight, then just starts traveling with her again after the story of Arc of Infinity. So It's just such a random time period, but it is a time period that is used quite often, actually, for stories in the expanded universe of Doctor Who. Right before this story was Winter for the Adapt, which we have previously discussed about probably a year ago, if not longer, but nonetheless, that was a Big Finish monthly deal from 2000. And there's also, as I recall, quite fun. If you like Portuguese and hauntings, that might be an deal for you. After this one, it's going to be Primeval, which is the 26th story in the monthly range, which comes out November 2001. And interestingly enough, it's written by Lance Polkin, who has a fun history in the Doctor Who Extended Universe, having written things from the VNAs to the EDAs, and even the new series. He wrote a 10th Doctor story, The Alice, which actually has a rather solid and atmospheric beginning. So I don't know much about Primeval, and Nyssa's never been the most interesting companion to me. But with him being the writer there, that could be a quite interesting story when we get to it.
Yeah, and I don't know much about Primeval either. And we've talked a little bit about how the Fifth Doctor is never one of our favorite Doctors, but I do like some of his more quiet moments. He, throughout the story, talks about some of the secrets of time travel that the Time Lords have, that Nyssa actually calls him out on, the fact he won't actually explain some of the stuff that he's concerned about. And I do think it adds a little more joy. And I have to say, generally speaking, I do think a lot of this story has a somewhat compelling mystery, like as to the origins of this mutant phase, and then some of the things that the Doctor himself is concerned about, including sort of a bump that the TARDIS felt when they were going through this time corridor, which the Doctor has concerns about, but we as the audience don't really know exactly what the nature of his concerns are.
Yeah, he just says there's jumping the time tracks and doesn't really go into any details. According to him, he can't divulge Time Lord secrets, as he says, which I'm not surprised at all. It's the Fifth Doctor, who I suppose the Time Lords are still around at the time. He really just doesn't divulge it. He doesn't really go into it other much. He explains a bit more later, but not the most specific explanation you could have.
Yeah, and I think for me, while I generally think the mystery is interesting, it is true, and I don't know if this really counts as spoilers, but the interesting thing about this story is, despite the fact that it's like the third part of this Dalek Empire thing, it doesn't have any relation to the event of the Apocalypse element. Like, I kept thinking at some point they're going to tie in the end of the Apocalypse element where the Daleks seem to have their own, now, I think it was a pocket universe that they have control over. I kept expecting that to pop up in some way or some reference to be made to that, but it literally never happens. Now, apparently there are some elements of this story that the lady used in the Dalek Empire spin-off. I have some suspicions as to what those elements are, but the point is that despite this being the third part of this preceding series, it's not actually connected aside from the fact that there are Daleks here, which is, to me it's somewhat, I don't say anticlimactic, but it's sort of in the way that you would sort of expect it to follow up on both Genocide Machine and Apocalypse element is somewhat unsatisfying in that way.
Yeah, and they set up those own expectations when they call it Dalek Empire Part 3. I know that's always been kind of unofficial, but either way, that's how a lot of people look at these certain stories. And when you're expecting something to come, and it doesn't come, as we have experienced throughout the entire RTD2 era, it makes the story at the end of the day more unsatisfying than it would have been. And that's sadly just how it works. On the whole, I do think it held up better than I was thinking it would in any case.
Yeah, I do have to be clear. I did still enjoy this story more than the Apocalypse element. So I'm not saying it's something that ruined the story, because it didn't, but it just made it somewhat more unsatisfactory. And I do wish the ending had been maybe a little more clear. I feel like they were moving pretty quickly toward the end, just trying to finish things off. And I wish it had been just a little more detailed as to what was exactly going on. Because you get into like some alternate timeline type stuff, and I just feel like if it had been given a little more breathing room, it might have come over a bit better, but that's just me.
Yeah, I knew what they were going for, but the ending of the story did have a almost rushed feel to it, which is kind of disappointing because it had been really good build-up, as you had previously said. The mystery was actually quite compelling, And I was maybe for the first time listening to a Fifth Doctor story really into the actual, what's happening here? Because I enjoyed elements of all of the previous ones you've listened to, Land of the Dead, Ra Down, Winter for the Adapt. But the overarching mystery is now for the big thing I was interested in when listening to those. And in this one, they actually was on the whole pretty good. It tapers off a bit once you find out what's going on. And the story takes a different track, especially during part 4. But on the whole, it worked out pretty well, especially for the Fifth Doctor. I thought the Fifth Doctor went very well with this story that was being told.
Yeah, I feel like if it had been another Doctor, certainly different actions would have been taken. But because the Fifth Doctor is a bit more, I'll just say polite. I mean, even at one point, he's like, "Oh, after you," talking to a Dalek, letting the Dalek go first, and the Dalek's just like, "Move!" Like, when the Doctor's even trying to be polite, even if it's somewhat facetiously, toward the Dalek, you know that this Doctor is not built like others.
No, that was pretty funny. The Daleks have no understanding or acceptance of patience. They're not very patient creatures. And it's always amusing to see Dalek interactions with other species. Because the Daleks truly do not give a fuck. They want what they want and they want it now. And that's really all there is to it. So it's just always a joy to see the Daleks. Even in stories that could have been better, I would say.
Yeah, and I don't really have much in the way of deep thoughts about this one. I think overall, it's a decent story. I think it's among Dalek stories more interesting than I was anticipating. Just because, and I've said this almost every time we've talked about a Dalek story, there's been so many of them that I sometimes find it hard to imagine them using Daleks in an actually interesting and fresh way. But because of some of the mystery elements here, I do think it was more interesting. I think it held up better than I was sort of expecting it would. That said, I still prefer the Genocide machine when it comes to, I guess, this Dalek Empire 3-part preceding series. But I am quite interested, and we'll actually be discussing them somewhat shortly, but I am sort of interested in diving into the actual Dalek Empire spin-off to see how that one goes.
Yeah, besides the Bernice Summerfield stuff, which actually predated the Doctor Who stuff anyway, it's the first spin-off from Big Finish. So I'm thinking it's probably going to try to set the standard, hopefully. I forget who the main writer was behind the first season, but I do hope those are good. Sometimes there's such a thing as too many Daleks in the story, and we'll see how grating the voice gets, but it's certainly going to be an interesting experience, and I look forward to that.
Yeah, I might be wrong, but I would imagine at least half the story is going to follow some human resistance or some resistance of some form.
Why do you want to resist the Daleks?
Well, I'm not sure, but I imagine they have some reasons that would probably be okay. And like I said, we'll be talking about this a bit sooner than you may or may not expect. But before that, up next we are actually going to be discussing The Sour Note, which is a short story featuring the second Doctor from the Doctor Who Annual 1968. And it's a short story with Ban and Pali as companions, so it's actually going to be a second Doctor story prior to Jamie, which cannot be all that common, and that should be somewhat interesting to see. And I actually don't remember how long the story is. I'll say it's 3 or 4 pages. I'm hoping for a little more meat here than what we got in something like The Disintegrator, so fingers crossed.
Yeah, the older prose stories in these Doctor Who annuals are a really interesting part of Doctor Who lore. These things, I think they were annuals from 1966 to 1986. They are last Warner, Sylvester McCoy ones. But they did happen as late as Colin Baker, the 6th Doctor. And these random prose stories, I assume there's going to be more meat than things like the TV comic stories, such as The Disintegrator, which we've talked about. But I still don't know how much like Doctor Who they're actually going to feel. And certainly the early ones, where in the story itself, they're often referred to as Doctor Who by the text, I'm sure they're going to feel very unusual. At least in terms of connections to Doctor Who, as we would understand it.
Yeah, and I don't doubt it. I think it's going to be sort of an interesting read. Hopefully there's a bit more to it. But when it comes to this story, I think it's decent. It's certainly better than the Apocalypse element, in my opinion. It's also a bit shorter, which makes it easier to get into. But I had a decent time. So if you've listened to this one, let us know what you thought about it. Let us know if you have the same opinions of being somewhat disappointed as it's not being connected as much to some of the previous Dalek stuff. But yeah, just let us know either down below here on YouTube or over on Twitter at Brothers Mahoney, where during this dark age of Doctor Who, you can reach out for some hope and some light. Because the one thing you can say about us is that we always bring light and hope to all who follow.
Jesus, I don't know if that's true, but Yeah, we can try, I guess.
Yeah, hey, we always try. That's all that matters. But anyhow, I think that's all we had. Did you have anything else about this one, bro?
No, not really. It doesn't cost much. You should just pick it up. It might even be free on Spotify. I know some of them are. Yeah, no, it's fine. It's at least more interesting than you would sometimes expect a Dalek story to be. So I think it's certainly worth the time. But besides that, I had nothing else.
Yeah, so like I said, let us know what you thought. But as always, you've been enjoying the Brothers Mahoney. This has been Michael.
And I've been James.
Thanks for listening, and I hope that you guys have a placid night.
And enjoy the ice talks.